Move now, or security removes you.
Show me the policy first. Move, or I call security. Your directive still needs authority. Stop the plane. Hydraulic leak. Cockpit, hold pushback immediately.
The moment Sandra Oaks stepped through the forward galley curtain and into the business cabin, she already knew which passenger she was looking for. She had been told it would be straightforward. A simple seat reassignment. A polite request, a smooth exchange, and everything would be back in order before the boarding door closed. That was how it always worked when a certain kind of passenger needed a certain kind of accommodation. She spotted him in the third row, seat 14A. Window seat left side. A black man, mid-40s, tall even while seated, wearing a charcoal gray suit with no visible lapel pin or tie bar. His briefcase was leather, well worn in the way that suggested use rather than neglect. His hands were on the tray table, resting on a folder, the other holding a pen that moved steadily across the margin of a document. He hadn't ordered champagne. He hadn't reclined his seat. He was simply working with the kind of focus that belonged to someone who did this exact thing on a regular basis. Sandra paused at the edge of the row, composed her expression into something pleasant, and took a quiet breath. She would be professional. She always was. The man glanced up before she spoke. His eyes were calm. Not the startled look of someone caught off guard, but the settled, unhurried attention of someone who had noticed her walking toward him from the moment she cleared the curtain. That was the first small thing that didn't fit the picture she'd assembled in her mind. She smiled anyway. "Good evening, sir. I'm so sorry to interrupt. My name is Sandra Oaks. I'm the lead flight attendant." Flight. He nodded once, the pen still in his hand. "Good evening. We have a situation that requires a small adjustment," she said. "See carefully. We have a very important passenger who has requested this particular seat. We'd like to offer you a comparable seat further back in the cabin. It's just a few rows, and of course, we'll make sure you're fully taken care of throughout the flight." She watched his face for the usual responses: surprise, mild irritation, followed by reluctant cooperation. Sometimes a question about upgrades or compensation. What she did not expect was the stillness she got. He set the pen down slowly, as if placing it somewhere precise. "I appreciate the introduction," he said, "but I'm in the seat I paid for. I chose this seat specifically. I understand, and I apologize for the inconvenience." Sandra kept the smile calibrated. "This passenger is a global tier member of our loyalty program. He has certain accommodations that," his voice still in your policy, he said, "those entirely even allows the airline to remove a confirmed ticketed passenger from a paid seat in order to place another passenger there." Sandra opened her mouth. The question was not rhetorical. He was actually asking. And in the 3 seconds she spent trying to locate the answer in her memory, she found nothing. The policy did not exist. She had been asked to do this as a favor, not as a dresser. And she had not thought to examine the difference until this moment. "I'll need to verify that with my supervisor," she said. "Please do," he said. He lifted his water glass and took a sip, then returned to his folder. Sandra turned and walked back toward the galley, aware that several passengers in the nearby rows had heard the entire exchange and were now watching her go. 2 rows further back, Bryce Calloway sat in 14C with his wireless earbuds in. Phone pressed flat against his palm, even though he hadn't been talking for the past minute. He was a tall man, thick through the shoulders, in a navy suit that fit the way expensive things fit, as though it had been made for him because it had been. He was 52 years old and had spent most of those years being given things without asking twice. He had heard the exchange. He was not concerned. Sandra was sorted. She always did. Marcus Ellison, because that was the name, on the boarding pass, tucked into the front pocket of the charcoal suit, did not look over at the man in 14C. He had noticed him during boarding, the loud phone call, the way he moved through the aisle as if the space belonged to him, the half second of eye contact that had carried in it the quiet assumption of authority. B. Marcus had cataloged all of it and returned to his documents. The folder in front of him held the preliminary filings for a commercial arbitration case in London, 340 pages. An international technology firm disputing a licensing agreement worth close to read it twice on the ground. He was reading it a third time now, because a third reading was where the gaps appeared. B. He was by profession and by inclination a man who looked for what other people missed, which was why, when he turned his gaze toward the window during a pause in his reading, he noticed the wing. The boarding lights of the terminal still swept across the tarmac below, catching the polished surfaces of the aircraft in long amber sweeps. The left wing stretched out into the darkness beyond, its flap mechanisms sitting flush in the cruise position. B, the engine nacelle, hanging beneath it like a dull silver weight. Everything looked correct for instance, but there was a line of light along the leading edge of the wing that was not the terminal lights. It was thinner, more localized, and it moved the wrong way when the ambient light shifted, catching the beam at an angle that water which ran down and dispersed would not. Marcus looked at it for 4 seconds, then looked away. It was probably nothing. Residual cleaning fluid, condensation pooling in an unusual way. There were 100 mundane explanations, and he was a lawyer, not an engineer. He wrote a note in the margin of his document, a single short phrase, and turned back to the arbitration language in front of him. The boarding door was still open. Passengers were still finding their seats. The business cabin had the particular kind of hum that preceded departure. Not quite quiet, not quite full. The sound of a room settling into itself. Sandra returned from the galley. This time there was no smile. "Sir," she said, standing at the end of his row, "I need to ask you again to move to seat 20E. We have confirmed this request through our senior crew." Marcus looked at her. Then he looked past her to where Derek Marsh was, standing at the boundary of the galley curtain, arms at his sides, watching. He closed his folder and set it on the tray table. This was the moment he recognized clearly, with the same clarity he brought to every piece of litigation he had ever touched, that this conversation was no longer about a seat. It was about who was allowed to hold their ground and who was expected to move simply because someone with apparent status had decided they should. He had been here before, not on this plane, but in this exact territory. He had lost count of how many times in his career he had walked into a room and watched someone recalibrate their expectations downward in the first 5 seconds. How many conference tables where the assumptions arrived before he did? How many handshakes that carried in them the slight, barely perceptible hesitation that said, "I was not expecting you." He did not raise his voice. He did not tighten his jaw or grip the armrest. He simply looked at Sandra Oaks and spoke in the same unhurried, deliberate tone he used when addressing arbitration panels. "I have a confirmed ticket for seat 14A on this flight. I have broken no rule and created no disturbance. Before we continue this conversation, I would like to see the specific regulation that authorizes your airline to remove a ticketed passenger from a confirmed seat in order to accommodate another passenger's preference." Sandra's mouth pressed into a thin line. Behind her, through the window at seat 14A, the light along the leading edge of the left wing shifted again, a slow, irritant shimmer, barely visible, sliding backward along the metal. Marcus saw it. A single line appeared between his brows. Then Sandra stepped forward, and his attention returned to her. The cabin around them had gone very quiet. Derek Marsh crossed the cabin in 8 steps and stopped at the end of the row with the practiced precision of someone who had handled difficult passengers before and had never once considered that he might be the difficult one. He was built broad, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of face that had been trained over years to express authority without emotion. His uniform was immaculate, His posture was a statement. He did not introduce himself. Sir, he said, his voice carrying the clipped confidence of a man issuing a directive, not making a request. I've been informed of the situation. I'm instructing you to move to seat 20E immediately. This will ensure an on-time departure. Marcus looked at him steadily. And you are. A brief pause. Derek Marsh. I'm the purser on this flight, Mr. Marsh. Marcus folded his hands on the tray table. I've been seated in this seat since boarding without incident. I have a confirmed reservation for 14A. I have not received a single reason, regulatory, procedural, or otherwise, that justifies removing me from it. So I'll ask you the same question I asked Ms. Oakes. What specific policy authorizes this request? Derek's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to having his authority questioned in the form of a structured legal inquiry. He was accustomed to passengers who objected emotionally, loudly, in ways he knew how to manage. This was different. This is a company directive, he said. I don't need to cite chapter and verse of the policy manual to every passenger who pushes back. Actually, Marcus said, when the directive involves removing a ticketed passenger from a confirmed seat, you do, or your airline does, in the litigation that would follow. From 2 rows back, Bryce Calloway unfolded from his seat. He stood in the aisle with his phone in one hand and his earbuds dangling from the other. The posture of a man who had arrived to supervise the resolution of something that should have been resolved already. Is this still going on? His voice carried easily through the business cabin. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. Men who had spent 2 decades being listened to learned to speak at exactly the volume that guaranteed attention. Derek, just handle it, Give him a credit. I'll cover it if the airline team won't. Sandra was already moving forward. She stopped at the edge of the row, her tone smooth and efficient. The practiced warmth of someone offering a resolution they believed was generous. Mr. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Ellison, Marcus said. Mr. Ellison, Mr. Calloway has offered to authorize a travel credit of $1,000 if you'll agree to move to seat 20E. That's a very generous accommodation. Marcus turned his head and looked at her with the same unhurried focus he might bring to a poorly constructed contract clause. Let me make sure I understand the offer, he said. You want me to vacate the seat I paid for and am legally entitled to occupy so that someone with a higher status designation can have it. And in exchange for that, for accepting what amounts to a discriminatory displacement, I receive $1,000 credit. It's not and your airline's position is that this constitutes fair treatment of a paying passenger. Sandra did not answer. Bryce stepped further into the aisle. He was used to the effect his presence had in a room. The way people shifted, recalibrated, made room, not because they were asked, but because proximity to his kind of certainty did something to people's spines. It did nothing to Marcus Ellison. You don't seem to understand how this works, Bryce said, his voice taking on the patient, slightly condescending tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. I've flown 2 million miles on this airline. I have relationships at the executive level. When I need a particular seat, it gets arranged. That's not discrimination. That's how preferred customer programs function. Marcus looked at him without moving. Not studying him, exactly. More like confirming something he had already determined. I understand exactly how it functions, Marcus said. I'm familiar with the relevant sections of the airline's contract of carriage, its published loyalty tier benefits, and the federal regulations governing involuntary bumping and seat reassignment. I've reviewed most of them as part of my professional work, and none of them give you, or this airline, the right to remove me from this seat. A brief silence fell over the row. Bryce's expression shifted slightly. Not retreat, men, like Bryce Calloway, did not retreat, but recalibration. The smallest adjustment, the way a man adjusts his stance when he has misjudged the terrain. And what professional work is that? He asked. I'm a senior partner at Ellison & Vance, Marcus said. He did not expand on this. He did not need to. From the row across the aisle, a man in his 50s looked up from his laptop with a slow blink of recognition. He had heard of Ellison's and Vance. Most people who moved into legal and financial circles had heard of Ellison and Vance. The firm had won a landmark aviation discrimination case 3 years ago, $80 million in damages. As suspicion be, the kind of verdict that changed how airlines train their people, he said nothing. But his eyes moved from Marcus to Bryce and back again with something that had not been there before. Bryce Calichor stood in the aisle for 2 more seconds, his phone still in his hand. Then he said, without looking at anyone, in particular Derek, "Handle this." And he returned to his seat. Derek looked at Marcus. The authority in his posture had not changed, but something behind his eyes had become slightly less certain. "Mr. Ellison," he said quietly, "this is your last opportunity to cooperate before I'm forced to escalate." "Escalate to what?" Marcus asked. "Airport security. If you refuse to comply with a crew directive, any directive from crew must be lawful and related to safety or the proper operation of the aircraft." Marcus's voice had not risen once during this entire exchange. It remained at the same register it had been when he said good evening. But it had acquired a particular quality, the way a fine edge acquires a quality when it is used deliberately. Reassigning a confirmed seat to satisfy another passenger's status preference does not qualify. "I'm happy to discuss this further with the captain." Derek opened his mouth and closed it again. Around the cabin, the had gradually stilled. No one was pretending to read anymore. A woman across the aisle had her water glass halfway to her lips and had held it there for nearly a minute. Near the back, two men in business attire looked at each other with the expression of people watching a chess match whose outcome they had suddenly become uncertain about. Marcus turned to the window. The light was there again, that thin, iridescent trace along the left wing's leading edge. He leaned slightly forward, his focus narrowing to a single point of attention. The boarding door was still open. There was still time. He exhaled quietly, and the line between his brows deepened by one small degree. 2 minutes passed in a silence that had texture. The boarding door was sealed now. The soft mechanical thunk of the latch had moved through the cabin like a period at the end of a sentence, and the ambient sounds of the terminal had been cut off. Now there was only the low hum of the auxiliary power, the filtered, recirculated air, and the collective breathing of a business cabin that had stopped pretending to be occupied with other things. Sandra Oaks stood at the galley entrance with her arms at her sides and her eyes on Derek Marsh, who stood at the head of the aisle, nearest to seat 14A. Derek was on his radio, his voice low and his back angled away from the passengers. From where Marcus sat, he could hear the rhythm of the conversation, but not the words. He had not reopened his folder. He sat with his hands resting on the tray table and his gaze moving between the 2 points that mattered, the crew at the galley and the window. The light was still there. It was not, as he had briefly hoped, condensation. Condensation did not pool at the leading edge of a wing flap and stay there. It did not catch light at an angle that water could not produce. It did not shift and elongate as the plane systems cycled through their pre-departure sequences. He had seen this before, not in person, but in photographs and in deposition exhibits. In the file review that had taken him 3 months to complete after an incident over the Gulf of Mexico 4 years earlier. He remembered the color specifically, the way the investigators had described it in their report. Iridescent, faintly blue-green under direct light, with the viscosity of hydraulic fluid that had viscosity of and then exposed to air. He looked away from the window. This was the moment he needed to be certain of what he was doing, not because he doubted what he had seen, but because he understood what was about to happen. He was a black man who had already refused to give up his seat to a wealthy white CEO. He was about to tell the crew there was a mechanical problem with the aircraft. Every instinct that people like Bryce Calloway operated on, every assumption baked into the way Senator and Derek had approached this situation, would tell them he was lying, that that he was manufacturing a crisis to be removed. He knew that. He knew the relevant statutes. They took the way he knew the clauses in an arbitration agreement, the way he knew every piece of terrain before he walked onto it. He had spent 20 years learning to see the room before the room saw him. He would still say it. Because the alternative was to stay silent, and then somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, the left wing's flap control system would lose high pressure, and that was not something he could live with. Derek returned from the galley, his expression arranged into the firm, final version of professional resolve. Mr. Ellison, I want to be direct with you. We are about to push back from the gate. If you do not move to seat 20E in the next 60 seconds, I will have no choice but to contact the gate agents and arrange for your removal from this flight. This is a crew directive. Failure to comply constitutes grounds for removal. I understand, Marcus said. Then you'll move. No, he said it quietly, the way he said everything. But I need to tell you something else, and I need you to hear it carefully. Derek's posture shifted in a way that said he did not intend to hear anything. Mr. Marsh, Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a lower register, the one he used when something needed to land with weight. I've been watching the left wing during boarding. There is a substance on the leading edge surface near the flap actuator, iridescent, blue-green under light, moving in a pattern inconsistent with water or cleaning residue. I believe it's hydraulic fluid. I need you to report this to the captain before this aircraft moves further. The cabin had been quiet before. Now went a different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when people realize the subject of the conversation has changed in a way that affects them directly. Sandra looked at Derek. Bryce Castaway's head came up from his phone. Derek stared at Marcus for 2 full seconds. His expression did not change, but something behind it recalculated. You're a lawyer, he said. Yes, You're not a mechanical engineer. No, but I've spent extensive time by reviewing hydraulic failure documentation as part of an aviation negligence investigation. I know what I'm describing. Bryce made a short, dismissive sound from his seat. He's stalling. This is what this is. He doesn't want to be removed, so he's manufacturing a safety concern. Derek glanced at Bryce. Then he looked back at Marcus. Sandra stepped forward, her voice controlled, but with the thin, sharp edge of someone who had decided this had gone far enough. Mr. Ellison, the aircraft is thoroughly inspected before every departure. Our technical team has signed off on this flight. If you're claiming a mechanical issue to avoid being removed from your seat, that is a serious matter. Marcus met her eyes. His voice did not change. So is ignoring a hydraulic leak at 35,000 feet. The silence returned, heavier this time. Someone in the row behind drew a slow, audible breath. Bryce Calloway put his phone face down on the tray table. It was a small gesture. The first time Marcus noticed that he had stopped holding it. Derek stood still for a moment. He was running through his options. Marcus could see it. The practiced calculation of a man who had managed difficult passengers in difficult situations and who knew how each category of response was supposed to unfold. A passenger who refused to move, escalate. A passenger who claimed a safety issue, different category entirely. If the passenger was wrong, ignoring it was protocol. If the passenger was right, ignoring it was catastrophic. The aircraft shifted slightly as the pushback tractor engaged. A low vibration moved through the floor. Hold position, Marcus said, and the steadiness of his voice was not calm. It was controlled. There is a difference. You need to call the captain right now. Derek reached for his radio. The radio crackled in Derek's hand. Cabin to cockpit. We have a passenger in 14A reporting a possible technical issue on the left wing. Requesting instructions. A brief pause. Then the captain's voice came through, unhurried and clear. Described the issue. Derek looked at Marcus. Marcus leaned slightly forward, his voice steady and precise. Iridescent fluid trace on the leading edge, near the flap actuator assembly, appears to be moving backward under air pressure. Blue-green cast under the terminal lights. Consistent with hydraulic fluid, not water or cleaning residue. Derek relayed this. A longer pause followed. Copy that. Tell the passenger I'm putting the aircraft in a hold. B. Ground engineering team to the left wing immediately. Do not push back further. B. The low vibration from the pushback tractor slowed and stopped. The business cabin absorbed this information in different ways. A woman 3 rows back pressed her fingers to her lips. A man in a window seat leaned toward the glass and then leaned back, as if he wanted to see the wing, but couldn't quite bring himself to. Bryce Calloway sat with his elbows on the armrest and his hands loosely clasped B, and his gaze fixed on the middle distance with the look of a man who had expected the world to arrange itself around him and was slowly becoming aware that it had not. Sandra stood at the edge of the aisle, her composure intact, but her color slightly different. Marcus turned back to the window. Ground crew appeared below, moving quickly across the tarmac. 3 men in reflective jackets, B. 2 of them carrying flashlights with beams strong enough to sweep across the wing from the ground. He watched them position themselves below the left wing, their lights tracing upward across the flap mechanism. No one in the cabin spoke. The lights moved in tight, methodical arcs, the way technicians move when they are looking at something real and they know it.
One of them.
Stopped and held his light steady on a single point. B. From inside the cabin, through the reinforced glass the distance, Marcus could see what they were seeing. The beam illuminated a thin, dark streak running backward from the leading edge. Not a smear, but a flow. B. The kind of flow that has direction and weight. Over the radio clipped to Derek's belt, a voice came through from the ground. Engineering to cabin, confirmed fluid leak, slat actuator, 3rd feed line. B. Recommend immediate hold, pending full inspection. B. The words came out flat and professional, the language of people trained to report facts without inflection. But the meaning of the words filled the cabin with something that had no professional term. It was the specific internal physics of understanding what you had almost done and what had stopped you. Derek's hand dropped slowly to his side, the radio still in it. Sandra said nothing. She pressed the back of one hand against her mouth. B. Not dramatically, just for a moment. B. A small involuntary gesture. From the back of the business cabin, a woman's voice, barely more than a whisper. Oh my God. Bryce Calloway did not move. His hands, which had been loosely clasped, were no longer loose. His knuckles, windows had whitened against the armrest. Marcus sat in seat 14A and looked out the window at the ground crew clustered beneath the wing, their lights still moving methodically across the surface of the metal. He felt none of the things that people would later expect a man in his position to feel. Not vindication, not satisfaction, just the flat, clarifying relief of a calculation that had resolved correctly. He had seen the light. He had recognized it. He had said what needed to be said to people who had given him every reason not to say anything at all. That was the whole of it. The intercom clicked, and Captain Raymond Cole's voice came through the speakers above every seat in the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain speaking. We have identified a maintenance issue on the aircraft and will be holding at the gate while our engineering team conducts an inspection. For your safety, this flight will be temporarily delayed. Please remain seated and remain calm. We appreciate your patience. The announcement moved through the cabin like water. Passengers began reaching for phones. Some pressed them to their ears. Some typed quickly, the soft tap of fingertips on glass adding itself to the low ambient hum. A young man 3 rows back stared at the ceiling for a moment, then exhaled. Then the captain came through the forward galley door. He was broad-shouldered with close-cropped gray at his temples, wearing his uniform with the particular ease of someone who had worn it for 30 years. He walked directly to seat 14A without stopping to speak to the crew. He extended his hand. Marcus stood. You're the passenger who made the report. The captain said it was not quite side of question. Yes, Captain. Raymond Cole. I've been flying for 31 years. He shook Marcus' hand once, firmly. I've had 2 emergency landings. and one aborted takeoff. Never had a passenger catch something my crew missed on the ground. He paused. The engineering team confirmed a genuine leak in the slat actuator feed line. If we had taken off tonight, he stopped, drew a breath. The flap control on the left wing would have lost hydraulic pressure over the Atlantic 3 to 4 hours out. Marcus said nothing. The captain said more quietly, "You saved everyone on this aircraft." "I saw something," Marcus said. "I knew what I was looking at. That's all." "That's not all," the captain said. He glanced once at Derek Marsh, who was standing near the galley entrance, looking at his shoes. Then he looked back at Marcus. "I'm aware of what was happening in this cabin before you made the report. I'll be addressing that directly." He paused. "Is there anything you need right now?" "No, Captain." "All right." Cole turned to the rest of the cabin, raising his voice just enough to carry. "Ladies and gentlemen, the passenger in seat 14A identified a mechanical issue that our ground crew has confirmed. We owe him a significant debt. I'll have more information shortly." No one spoke for a moment. Then the applause started. It began somewhere in the middle rows, scattered and tentative at first, and then it grew and spread forward. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of a performance, but the disorganized, genuinely felt kind, the sound of people who understood in a way they had not 30 seconds ago what they had almost lost. Marcus sat back down. He did not look at Bryce Calloway. He did not need to. He looked out the window at the men in reflective jackets, still working the wing, their lights painting the metal surface in careful, systematic sweeps, and he thought about the folder in London and the arbitration case waiting in London, and the fact that tomorrow he would be on a different flight, and none of the people in this cabin would matter to his work at all, except that they were alive, all of them, including the ones who had spent the past 40 minutes telling him to move. The flight was canceled at 22 minutes past 10. Captain Cole made the announcement himself, standing in the forward galley with the intercom pressed to his mouth, his voice carrying the kind of authority that did not invite discussion. "Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety, Transglobal Airways Flight 218 has been canceled this evening. The maintenance issue we identified cannot be resolved in a time frame that allows for a safe departure. All passengers will be rebooked on the earliest available options. Gate agents are prepared to assist you. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, and we thank you for your patience." The groans were immediate, the sighs, the sound of people recalculating schedules, recalculating plans, reaching for phones to send the messages that explained why they weren't going to arrive where they were supposed to arrive. And then, threaded underneath all of that, the applause again, still spontaneous, louder this time. Marcus gathered his folder into his briefcase and fastened the buckle with steady hands. Around him, passengers were rising and reaching into overhead bins. The cabin, returning to the organized disorder of boarding, played in reverse. No one looked at him quite the same way they had when he boarded. Sandra Oaks appeared at the end of his row. She stood there for a moment before speaking. The precision of her uniform had not changed. Her posture had not changed, but something behind her eyes had, and she seemed to be aware that the mask she had worn through this entire flight, professional, certain, faintly superior, had cracked at a seam she hadn't noticed, until the captain had confirmed the leak. "Mr. Ellison," her voice was lower than it had been before. "I'm sorry for how I handled this. I was wrong." Marcus looked at her. He did not feel the particular satisfaction that would have been understandable in this moment. What he felt was something closer to recognition, the recognition of a person standing in the gap between who they had been 30 minutes ago and who they were now, and not by certain which version was real. "You were doing your job," he said. "The problem wasn't you doing your job. The problem was the job as you understood it, and that's not entirely your fault." Sandra nodded slowly, her jaw tight. "The crew will face a review," she said, more to herself than to him. "Yes," he said, "they will." He picked up his briefcase and stepped into the aisle. Bryce Calloway was standing near the exit. He had been standing there for several minutes, facing the forward door, his bag in his hand and his earbuds back in, the posture of a man who had decided to wait without appearing to wait. His phone was in his pocket for the first time since he'd boarded. When Marcus came, even with him, Bryce turned. The look on his face was not the face he had worn for the past hour. The authority was still there in the structure of his jaw and the set of his shoulders, because that kind of certainty lives in the body, not just the mind. But it was no longer animated. It was what was left when the certainty stopped believing in itself. He opened his mouth. Something came out that was not quite words. The beginning of a sentence, perhaps. Something that might have been a thank you, or might have been an acknowledgement, or might have been an explanation. But it stopped before it became any of those things, because the years of operating in the world as Bryce Calloway had made certain kinds of words very difficult to form. We were the same plane, Marcus said quietly. He did not say it to wound. He did it because it was precise and true, and it was the only thing he wanted Bryce to understand before they walked off in separate directions. Same plane, same sky, same risk. Whatever you think separates us, it wasn't working tonight. Bryce's jaw moved once. His eyes held something that might have been, under different circumstances and in a different man's face, the beginning of shame. He said nothing. Marcus walked past him and through the forward door. The terminal at JFK stretched out around him, bright and loud and entirely indifferent to what had just happened on the aircraft parked at gate B7. People moved in every direction. Departure boards blinked and scrolled. Somewhere ahead, a child was crying with the particular intensity of a child, too tired to be in an airport. An airline employee appeared at his elbow, young, with the careful courtesy of someone who had been told to be careful. Mr. Ellison, my name is Jessica Park. I'm the gate supervisor. The airport director would like to speak with you, if you have a moment. He's in the executive lounge. It's just down the corridor. Of course, Marcus said. She led him through the general population of the terminal, past the rebooking lines already forming, past a cluster of passengers from Flight 218 gathered around a departure screen, most of them on their phones. One man in the group looked up as Marcus passed and said, loud enough to be heard by the people around him, "That's him. That's the one who stopped the flight." A few heads turned. A few people looked. Marcus kept walking. Behind him from the gate area, he could already hear a voice rising above the general noise of the terminal. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The voice was controlled, but strained, the sound of a man who was accustomed to that question producing immediate results and had not yet accepted that tonight it would not. "I am a shareholder in this airline. I need to be on a flight tonight. I have a meeting in London that cannot be rescheduled, and I expect this to be handled accordingly." Marcus did not look back. He followed Jessica Park down the corridor. The executive lounge was warm and quiet, amber light, leather chairs, the distant sound of the terminal, muffled behind a soundproof door. A tall man in his 60s stood to meet him as he entered, white-haired, well-dressed, with the unhurried manner of someone who has spent enough years in authority to be comfortable with it rather than performing it. "Mr. Ellison," Alan Griffith said and extended his hand. "I'm the airport director. Thank you for coming. And thank you sincerely, not as a formality for what you did tonight." Marcus shook his hand. "I saw something I recognized," he said. "It would have been wrong not to report it." Griffith held his gaze for a moment, as if weighing the simplicity of that statement against the complexity of the night. "The engineering team's full assessment will take several hours," he said. "But the preliminary report is not ambiguous. The feed line had been leaking since before pushback. At altitude, the pressure differential would have accelerated the failure." He paused. "Captain Cole's estimate is that control of the left wing's flap system would have degraded within 2 to 3 hours of cruise altitude." Marcus nodded once. "I want you to know," Griffith continued, "that Transglobal is opening an internal investigation. The manner in which you were treated tonight, The request to vacate your seat, to crew authority, the implicit threats of removal, none of that is consistent with our policy. Regardless of which passenger was involved, he exhaled slowly. I owe you a personal apology on behalf of this airline. Thank you, Marcus said. He meant it. But he also knew that the apology and the investigation were not the same thing. And what mattered was the investigation. Outside the lounge window, the tarmac stretched toward B7B, where the ground crew was still working the wing under floodlights, their beams cutting patient lines across the metal. Marcus watched them for a moment. Somewhere in the terminal behind him, Bryce Calloway's voice had gone quiet. By the time Marcus left the executive lounge, the rebooking lines at Gate Bay 7 had grown into something that resembled a small crowd with a grievance. Gate agents worked their screens with the concentrated efficiency of people managing a situation that was manageable, but only barely. The mood in the terminal was the usual mix of resignation and low-grade irritation that accompanies unexpected delays. What was not usual was the cluster of passengers from Flight 218 gathered near the gate entrance, most of them on their phones. Some of them filming something happening at the far end of the counter. Marcus did not intend to look, but he heard the voice clearly because it was the kind of voice that had been engineered over a lifetime to carry. I don't want to hear about tomorrow morning. I need a flight tonight. I need a private option, charter, if necessary. You are going to make this happen. Bryce Calloway stood at the premium counter with his bag at his feet and his jacket open, his posture carrying the last remaining architecture of authority, even as the circumstances around it had collapsed. The gate agent across from him, a young woman with a name badge that read Nora, was responding with the particular composure of someone who has been trained for exactly this kind of interaction, but had never quite expected it to be this thorough. Mr. Calloway, I completely understand your frustration. The flight cancellation affects all passengers equally. Our earliest available business class option departs tomorrow morning at 7:15 and we're happy to arrange hotel accommodation in the meantime. I've already told you I can't do tomorrow morning. His voice had gone lower. Not quieter, the distinction mattered. Low and tight, the sound of pressure behind a valve. Do you understand who you're talking to? I have a stake in this company. I don't accept tomorrow morning as an answer. Someone nearby was definitely filming. The phone was held at waist level, but the angle was deliberate. Nora held her composure with admirable steadiness. Sir, the cancellation is due to a safety issue identified on the aircraft. We have no alternative available this evening that meets our safety and scheduling requirements. The safety issue, Bryce said, and the words came out with a particular sharpness, was caused by one passenger making a scene, and delaying an aircraft that had already been certified for departure. I lost a flight and a meeting worth. If you had boarded that aircraft, a voice said from behind him, you might not have made it to that meeting. Bryce turned. Marcus stood several feet away with his briefcase at his side, his posture the same as it had been in seat 14A, unhurried, occupying exactly the space he occupied, no more and no less. The cluster of people around the gate had gone quiet. Bryce stared at him. You, he said, it came out wrong, with too many things crammed into a single syllable, recognition, frustration, something that might have been embarrassment if it had been allowed to finish forming. The engineering team confirmed it's a genuine fault, Marcus said. He wasn't raising his voice. He didn't need to. The flap control system would have failed over the Atlantic. That's the reason the flight was canceled. Not because anyone made a scene. Bryce's jaw tightened. The phone at his side was still in his hand, and he was gripping it the way people grip things when they need something to hold on to. You think you're a hero, he said. It was not really a question. It was the last thing he could reach for. The framing that let him retain something. No, Marcus said simply. I'm a lawyer who knows what hydraulic fluid looks like. We were on the same aircraft. The risk was the same for both of us. He paused. The difference is that I saw it. And I said something, even though saying it meant dealing with you. The word landed cleanly, not cruelly. He had not said it to wound, but cleanly, with the precision of something that was simply true. Bryce did not respond. A woman in the crowd exhaled a small, involuntary sound. Someone else's phone was definitely recording. Marcus turned to Nora. I'm Marcus Ellison. I understand Mr. Griffith's office has arranged an accommodation for tonight. Yes, sir, she said immediately. The Intercontinental. We have a car waiting. He nodded. Thank you. He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the exit. As he passed the cluster of onlookers, he did not look at any of them, not to be dismissive, but because he had learned over many years that the moment of looking around to gauge the effect something you've said is also the moment you become a different kind of person than you intended to be. He had not said what he said for an audience. Outside the terminal, the night air hit him, cold, carrying the smell of jet fuel and rain, wet concrete, the ambient roar of an airport that never entirely stops. The car was waiting at the curb as described, a dark sedan with a driver who recognized him immediately and opened the rear door without being asked. Marcus settled into the back seat. The door closed. The terminal sounds dropped away. He pressed his head gently against the headrest and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The leather case was on the seat beside him. Inside it, the arbitration folder was exactly where he had left it, the pages undisturbed. The argument still intact, still waiting. London, tomorrow. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket and found his boarding pass. The one for tonight's canceled flight. Seat 14A, window seat, left side. He looked at it for a moment in the ambient light of the car. Then he folded it once, carefully, along the original crease, and put it back in his pocket. The car pulled out from the curb, and the airport fell behind them. And Marcus Ellison looked out the window at the moving city lights and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he could come in moments like this to rest. The video appeared online at 11:47 that night. Whoever had recorded it had done so with a steady hand and a clear angle, and the audio was sharper than it had any right to be, given the ambient noise of the terminal. 37 seconds. Bryce Calloway at the premium counter, his voice tight with contained fury, telling the gate agent she did not understand who she was talking to. The gate agent maintaining her composure with the quiet professionalism of someone who had decided not to be the story. And then at the 20-second mark, the voice from behind him, measured, precise, unraised, explaining what the flight cancellation had actually been about. The caption someone attached read simply, the man they tried to remove from his seat just saved the flight. By morning, it had 4 million views. By noon, 8 hashtags were trending in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada. The most durable one was a single word. Seat 14A. Marcus woke in the hotel room at 6:15, as he always did, without an alarm. He stood at the window for a moment in the gray early light, watching the airport in the distance. The runways were active even at this hour, the patient, methodical work of aircraft moving in and out of the terminal. Each one a small system of competing pressures held in equilibrium by training and protocol, and the kind of vigilance that had to be practiced deliberately to stay reliable. He dressed, ate breakfast at a corner table near the window, read through 40 pages of the arbitration file, and checked his phone for the first time just before 8. There were over 200 messages. He scrolled through them without responding, reading enough to understand the scope of what had happened overnight. His firm, his partners, colleagues he hadn't spoken to in years, journalists, quite a few journalists, and lower in the scroll, Alan Griffith. Mr. Ellison's, I wanted you to see this before you hear it elsewhere. Transglobal has released a statement this morning. Sandra Oaks and Derek Marsh have both been suspended pending a full review. The internal investigation will examine the incident from the original seat request through the departure hold. I expect the findings will be thorough. Also, and I say this personally as much as professionally, What you did last night deserved to be recognized the same night it happened. I'm sorry it wasn't. AG. Marcus read this twice, then set the phone face down. He was not unaffected. B. He was not the kind of man who performed indifference as a substitute for having none. B. He had spent a difficult night on an aircraft full of people who had decided, before he spoke's first sentence, what kind of person he was. He had been threatened with security. He had been offered money to make himself smaller. He had been mocked in public by a man whose wealth had made that mockery feel safe. All of that had happened. And then he had reported a hydraulic leak, and every one of those people had gone home alive. He sat with this for a moment, in the way he sat with everything that mattered, fully, without looking away, without reaching for a comfortable frame. Then he picked up the phone and replied to Griffith, "Thank you for the message. Please ensure the investigation focuses on process rather than individuals where possible. What I'd like to see changed is the structure that made this feel like an acceptable request in the first place." He sent it, and then booked the 7:15 flight to London, 40 floors above Park Avenue, in the headquarters of Callaway Ventures. The morning was less calm. The video had traveled through the professional networks of finance, law, and venture capital with the same indifferent efficiency that all viral content travels. And by 9 o'clock, it had reached people who sat at it. And then it had reached people who ran boards, people who sold E. And by 10:30, a board meeting had been called that had not been on anyone's calendar 24 hours earlier. Bryce Callaway sat at the head of his table and looked at the faces around it and understood, in the particular way that people understand things they have spent a long time avoiding, that the calculation Clara had changed. The woman to his left, Clara Haynes, the board's lead director, he had set a printed copy of the videos most shared still on the table in front of her. It was the frame from the terminal where Bryce's face was visible, mouth half open, the expression on it exactly what it was. A man certain of his authority. In a moment, his authority was evaporating. "CalPERS withdrew $500 million this morning," she said. "I heard from 2 other major holders before this meeting. They're watching. Watching." Bryce said nothing. "This isn't about one night at an airport," Clara continued. "It never is. You've given people a clean image to put on something they were already thinking. The way you treated that crew member. The things you said about the passenger." She paused. The passenger who saved the flight. Someone at the far end of the table shifted in their chair. The chairman, a man named Gerald Ford, who was unrelated to any president and was precise about that distinction, folded his hands, and spoke in the voice he used for things that were already decided. "Bryce, we're going to ask you to step down from the CEO position, effective immediately. The transition plan is already drafted. We'd like to announce it this afternoon before the market." Close. Bryce looked at him. He looked at the other faces. Not a single one offered him the expression he had spent a career training people to give him. The pen was already on the tree. He picked it up and signed the document in front of him, and the click of its cap going back on was the quietest sound in the room. Outside the windows, the city stretched out in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the same as it had been yesterday and the day before, grand from the right elevation, fragile after viewed from anywhere honest. The arbitration suite at the International Commercial Arbitration Tribunal in London was not dramatic. It was a large room with high ceilings and diffuse northern light, and a long table at which 12 people sat, half on each side, with two arbitrators at the head. The walls held decorative. Brahma to Rip. The carpet was the color of things designed not to distract. There was no audience. Marcus had been in rooms like this many times. He had been nervous in them, early in his career, and then not nervous, and then familiar with them in the way that any person becomes familiar with the place where they do their most important work. He settled his files in front of him and uncapped his pen and waited. The opposing team arrived 60 seconds later, 5 attorneys from a London firm with a name that ran to 4 surnames, led by Richard Hensley, silver-haired, self-assured, with the particular ease of a man B, who had won enough horses in enough prestigious rooms to stop noticing whether a room was prestigious. B. He crossed to Marcus's side of the table and extended his hand with a smile that was professional and slightly condescending in the specific way that certain kinds of confidence produce. "Mr. Ellison," he said, "I understand you had quite an eventful journey to London." "The journey was fine," Marcus said. "I'm glad to be here." He shook Hensley's hand once and returned to his files. Hensley paused for a fraction of a second and then returned to his side of the table. The proceeding opened at 9 o'clock. The issue was a licensing dispute between a technology company Marcus represented and an investment consortium that held downstream rights to the same intellectual property. The consortium was connected through 3 layers of corporate structure to a European fund that had previously been a minority partner in Callaway Ventures. That connection was not relevant to the case. Marcus noted it and set it aside. What was relevant to the case was Clause 17B of the licensing agreement, signed 22 months earlier, which contained a confidentiality restriction on how the consortium could reference its licensing relationship in regulatory filings. They had violated it. Not dramatically, not in a way that was obvious. The violation was in a footnote of an SEC-adjacent disclosure document 19 pages deep, in language that closely paraphrased the original agreement without technically quoting it. It was the kind of violation that survived precisely because most lawyers who reviewed the disclosure would not have also reviewed the original agreement against which to compare it. Marcus had reviewed both. He waited through the first 2 hours of the proceeding, during which the opposing team presented extensive financial analysis, comparative market data, and a submission that ran to 260 pages. He listened without interrupting. He took 8 notes. He did not perform attention or engagement because he had no need to perform either. He was simply present, and the quality of his presence was the kind that accumulates weight over time in a room. When the opposing team finished its opening submission, the lead arbitrator turned to Marcus. "Mr. Ellison, you may respond." He stood. He spoke for 23 minutes without notes, which surprised the arbitrators and unsettled the opposing team in the particular way that thoroughness can unsettle people, who have prepared for a different kind of opponent. He did not raise his voice. He did not use rhetorical flourish. He walked through the timeline of the licensing agreement, the terms of the confidentiality clause, and the specific language in the filing that violated it, citing the paragraph, the page, and the date of the filing with precision. Then he said, "The opposing submission is comprehensive in its financial analysis. However, it proceeds as though Clause 17B does not exist. It was not addressed in their opening. It is not addressed in their supporting materials." He paused. "I would invite the panel to consider why that might be." Hensley was already reaching for his files. The arbitrators exchanged a brief glance. "Mr. Hensley," the lead arbitrator said carefully, "do you wish to respond to Clause 17B at this stage?" Hensley's response took 90 seconds and answered nothing. The confidence was still there in his voice because it had been there long enough to remain even when the argument beneath it had lost its footing. But the room could hear the difference. The session broke for lunch at 1 o'clock. Marcus ate at a small table in the ground floor cafe, along with his files, and read through 3 additional documents that he did not need to read again, but found it useful to have in front of him while he thought. His phone buzzed once with a message from his assistant back in New York. "The video has passed 12 million views. Journalists are asking about an official statement. Do you want to respond to any of them?" He typed back, "No, let the story speak for itself." He set the phone aside and returned to his files. That afternoon, the panel moved into a preliminary review of the clause Marcus had raised. By 4 o'clock, the lead arbitrator indicated that the filing in question would be subject to close examination before the next session. and that the opposing team should be prepared to address the confidentiality question directly. B. It was not a verdict, but was not a economy a proceeding like this one. It was the kind of development that resolves into a verdict eventually in one direction. Marcus repacked his briefcase as the room cleared. B. Hensley passed him near the door. Stop, B. And looked at him for a moment with a particular expression of a professional who has encountered a better prepared professional. Clause 17B, Hensley said. We missed it. Yes, Marcus said. There was nothing else to say, so he walked past him and out into the gray London afternoon. It had begun to rain. Not heavily, the city's particular variety of fine, persistent mist that felt less like weather and more like the atmosphere deciding to be more present. He stood on the steps of the building and did not move for a moment, letting the cold touch his face, feeling the weight of the day settle into something he could carry. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Alan Griffith. Mr. Ellison. TransGlobal has released its official investigation findings. Both crew members involved in the incident will not be returning to their positions. The company has also committed to a comprehensive revision of its seating reassignment procedures, and a new mandatory training module for all cabin crew. The module will be named the TG-218 Protocol. It's the first policy of its kind at a major U.S. carrier. We wanted you to know that before you read it anywhere else, and to say again that we are grateful. Marcus read this twice. Then he looked out at the street, at the thin rain moving through a light from the building windows, at the black cab and red buses moving through their patient city rhythms, the TG-218 protocol. He thought about that for a moment, about the fact that somewhere in a training room, he imagined it with ordinary fluorescent lighting and stackable chairs, and a projector that sometimes needed to be restarted. People would sit and be told about what had happened on a specific aircraft on a specific night, and why it mattered, and what it required of them going forward. He had not sought that. He had sought to sit in his seat, which he had paid for, and do his work and get to London. But here was this, a policy name for the flight number of the plane he had not in the end boarded. A new procedure built around the fact that a man had refused to move. He typed his reply to Griffith. I hope they learned the right lesson from it, not just the seat policy, the whole of it. He pressed send, tucked the phone away, and walked down the steps into the rain. 2 weeks after the cancellation of TransGlobal Flight 218, the story had traveled far beyond the people who had been on it. It had been reported on CNN and NPR and BBC, and on a dozen legal and business publications, each covering a different angle: the aviation safety angle, the discrimination angle, the corporate governance angle, the corporate governance. The hashtag Seat410A had become a shorthand for something larger than a seat, used by teachers in discussions about leadership and by lawyers in ethics seminars, and by a professor at Georgetown who had assigned the case, the real case, the one she had assembled from public documents and passenger accounts, as a reading for her professional ethics class. None of this reached Marcus directly. He knew it was happening the way a person knows about weather in a city they're not currently in, from the occasional report, the edge of awareness, without it altering the immediate conditions of his day. His days had resumed their usual shape. Morning at 5:30, the long corridor of Ellison and Vance's offices by 8, smelling of coffee and the particular combination of printer toner and leather that belonged only to this space. Depositions, filings, the arbitration follow-up documents from London, still requiring review. A new case involving a regional carrier's maintenance protocols that had landed on his desk the previous Tuesday. He had not spoken to the press. His assistant, Carolyn, had declined the interviews professionally and without elaboration. There had been a brief statement from the firm, a single paragraph, drafted by Marcus, that described what had happened on the aircraft in factual terms, and thanked TransGlobal for conducting a thorough investigation. That was all. Carolyn had fielded the subsequent follow-up inquiries with the patience of someone whose job was, in part, to protect a specific kind of quiet. On the 11th morning after London, Marcus arrived at his office to find a box on his desk. It was not large, medium weight cardboard, the kind used for shipping things that needed to be protected rather than just contained. There was no packing slip visible. The exterior was clean. A card was tucked under the flap, handwritten in the careful script of someone who did not write by hand often, but had wanted this to be by hand. He opened the card first, to a man who saw clearly when others chose not to look, from someone who is grateful to still be here to say so. With respect and thanks, Raymond Cole. He opened the box. Inside, nestled in gray foam, was a die-cast model of a Boeing 777 at a scale of 1 to 120. The kind of model that was made to be accurate, the landing gear retracted, the engine nacelles correctly proportioned, the livery painted in the transglobal colors, with the registration number rendered in white along the fuselage. Along the body, in small, precise lettering that required close examination to read, someone had engraved a line, to Marcus Ellison, who grounded pride and kept lives in flight. He held the model for a moment, turning it slightly in the office light, feeling the cool weight of the cast metal against his fingers. The detail was exact. The wings were correct. The proportions were what they should be. He set it down carefully on the desk and sat with it. For a moment, carrying the particular quality, the doorway. She had the particular quality of someone who had worked for a private, self-contained person long enough to read the temperature of a room from a distance. Journalists again, she said. 2 from New York outlets, 1 from Chicago. They're asking about the model. Someone saw the captain posted something. Declined them. Marcus said also, and they're going to say no, there's a vague request stick from a law school. They want you to talk about intersection of seeking law and civil rights. It's the second one this week. He thought about this. Tell them I'll send a written statement, he said. If they want to use it in their curriculum, they're welcome to. Carolyn nodded, unsurprised, and disappeared. Marcus picked up the model again. He walked to the shelf behind his desk, which held a row of thick law volumes in dark green spines, and 2 framed photographs, one of his parents, one of himself at 40, with a group of people he had mentored through a nonprofit he'd been involved with for 12 years. He found a space at the end of the shelf, between a volume on his international arbitration and a ceramic mug holding extra pens that he had meant to move for approximately 3 years. He set the model there. The silver finish caught the window light and held it. The tiny wings extended, the perfect miniature of a machine whose real-life equivalent he had nearly boarded, and had not his phone buzzed. Griffith again. The TG-218 protocol has been officially adopted as a required training module for all transglobal cabin crew, effective immediately. It covers 3 areas: seat reassignment procedure and passenger rights, de-escalation for crew passenger disputes, and unconscious bias in in-flight service. They're using what happened as the opening case study. I thought you should know, Marcus set the phone down on the desk and looked at the model on the shelf. He did not feel what people expected him to feel. Not triumph. Not the particular satisfaction of having been proven right in a way that others had to acknowledge. Those things were real, he supposed, in their way, but they were not what he felt sitting in this office on this morning. What he felt was something quieter, the specific quality of having done what was correct, fully, without abridging it, and having it resolve into something that would continue after him, a policy, a protocol, a curriculum, a set of procedures that would apply to the next person, and the next, and the next. He had not wanted to be a story. He had wanted to sit in his seat, do his work, and arrive where he was going. But when the moment had asked something of him, asked him to speak clearly at the cost of being dismissed, to report danger to people who had given him every reason not to trust them, he had not looked away from it. That was not heroism. It was simply what a person did when they understood what was at stake. He picked up his pen and opened the next file. Outside the office windows, the city moved. Taxis, pedestrians, the morning light, cutting long across the buildings from the east. The ordinary, enormous business of a city that contained, inside it, 1,000 stories exactly like this one, a person's doing the right thing in a moment that asked for it, and the world being quietly, measurably different because of it. He returned to his work. The model airplane had been on the shelf for 18 days when Carolyn appeared in the doorway, when the looks required more than a brief exchange. He's here, she said. Marcus looked up from his files. Who is? Bryce Calloway. The name did not change the room the way it might have once. It landed flat without the weight it had carried in the business cabin, without the ambient authority it had projected in the terminal. It was simply a name belonging to a person who had asked to see him. Send him in, Marcus said. He set his pen down and waited. Bryce Calloway did not look like the man who had stood in the aisle of Transglobal Flight 218 with absolute certainty in the permanence of his own importance. He was dressed well. Men like Bryce Calloway dressed well, even when they had nowhere particularly to be. But the quality of his presence had changed in a way that could not be attributed to clothing or posture. He was 52 years old and had spent two of the most expensive weeks of his career being a symbol of something he had never intended to symbolize: the board meeting, the resignation, the stock price, tracked for days in every financial outlet with a headline to fill, the video which had not gone away. He stood at the threshold of Marcus's office for a moment, looking at himself behind the desk with an expression, moved through something before settling. May I sit? He asked. Yes, Marcus sighed. Bryce sat in the chair across the desk, the same chair where clients sat when they needed help, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man deciding whether to approach something directly or sideways, and then deciding directly. I wanted to come myself, he said. I didn't want to send a letter or have someone call. Marcus waited. I've been thinking about what you said at the terminal, Bryce continued. Same plane, same sky, same risk. He paused. Asakaja, not in the moment, not in any honest way. He set his hands on his knees and looked at them briefly. I've had a long time to think about it since. What did you conclude? Marcus asked. Bryce looked up. That I was wrong. Not just about the seat, about the way I read the situation, about what I thought I was entitled to. He was quiet for a moment. About what I thought you were. The office held this for a moment. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual patterns. A siren somewhere several blocks away. The muffled sound of traffic. The specific quality of a New York afternoon that was simply ordinary and ongoing, indifferent to the conversations happening above it. Bryce said. I'm not asking you to accept an apology, Bryce said. I know I don't get to walk in here and have that resolved. He exhaled slowly. But I'm asking you to know that I understand what happened. All of it. What you saw and what it cost you to say it, and what would have happened if you hadn't. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You understand one piece of it, he said finally, without sharpness. The part where I saved the flight. That's the part the story made easy to understand. He picked up his pen and turned it once in his fingers. The part before that, what it was like to sit in a seat I had paid for and be told, in front of a full cabin, that I needed to move for someone who had decided he outranked me. That part is harder to walk into from the outside. Most people don't. Bryce housed his gaze. He did not look away. That, at least, was different from the man in the aisle. I know, he said. I'm not going to tell you how to carry that, Marcus said. That's yours. He set the pen down. But if you want to make something of this visit besides a conversation, I'd suggest you look at what Callaway Ventures funds that touches aviation, hospitality, transportation, companies that have policies like the one Transglobal had, and consider whether you're in a position to change any of them. Bryce looked at him for a long moment. That's a practical suggestion, he said. I'm a practical man, Marcus said. A thin pause, and then something that was not quite a smile passed across Bryce's face. Not the smile he had worn on the aircraft, which had been the performance of ease, but something more uncertain and therefore more real. He stood and extended his hand. Marcus shook it. After Bryce left, Marcus sat in the quiet of his office for several minutes. The afternoon light had moved across the floor as the sun dropped toward the west, and the shelf where the model airplane sat caught it now at a different angle, the silver fuselage reflecting back a small bright point that moved slowly across the wall as the minutes passed. He looked at it. One seat, one night, one moment of seeing something clearly and choosing to say it, even when saying it was costly, even when the people he needed to convince had every reason not to believe him. He had not saved those people because he was extraordinary. He had saved them because he had paid attention and because he had refused to be made small enough to stay quiet. He stood and walked to the window. New York spread below him in the long afternoon light, the buildings and the river, and the particular haze of a city that contains more stories than any one person can hold. Somewhere in that city, a policy document with the words TGTT Protocol on its cover was being distributed out to airline staff who would read it in training rooms and take from it something they would carry into the air with them. The window reflected him back, a man in his 40s, in a charcoal suit, standing in a well-ordered office in a city that had mostly moved on to other things. He looked at himself for a moment without judgment. Then he turned back to his desk. There was more work to do. There was always more work to do. And the work mattered. That was the part that hadn't changed, that wouldn't change, that was simply and quietly true. The work mattered, and doing it well mattered, and showing up to it mattered. And refusing to be moved from the place where you had every right to stand mattered most of all. He picked up his pen. He opened his file. If this story made you think about what it means to hold your ground when the world tells you to step aside, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe, because the most important stories are rarely the loudest ones. They're the ones told quietly by the person who stayed in their seat.